I would ask you this morning then, if you would, to turn to the book of Esther. The book of Esther in the Old Testament. A little book nestled right after Nehemiah in your Bible, although, as you remember from last week's sermon, the actual events that take place actually occur prior to the book of Ezra, chronologically that is. And so we're going to be looking at this book. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to finish this book in 6 sermons. We're going to zip through this book fairly quickly between now and mid-July. And the reason that I'm doing that is because the Kaleo students will only be here until mid-July, and I promised them I'd have this book finished before they left. So we got to do it in 6. Now, that's not unreasonable. I don't think that's rushing it, frankly. I think there's a comfortableness in the various sections that we work through. In fact, I went ahead and did something this week that I've never done before in an expositional series, and that is I laid out all the sermons that I'm going to preach. I didn't write all the outlines for them, but I did give a name and a pericope, a passage of text to each one. So I know what I'm going to be preaching through for the next 6 weeks. I think it's a comfortable schedule. This is a short book. It's a narrative, and I believe that it's possible to do. And what we're going to be looking at, I think, are realistic pericopes of text. We're going to be looking at reasonable sections encompassing events in a logical structure. Today we'll look at the downfall of Queen Vashti and the rise of Queen Esther, and then as we go into the future we'll look at the plot of Haman, we'll look at Esther agreeing to help her revelation of Haman's plot, the work to save the Jews from the plot, and the institution of Purim. So it's really it really is easily broken down into those 6 pieces, so it's not that difficult. I would ask if you would read ahead in the text. Read the next upcoming section, or at least read the rest of the book. It isn't that long. Certainly read through it in anticipation of each week, because I don't want to have to read all this text from the pulpit on the Sunday morning. I'm going to assume that you've read it, and therefore I'm simply going to preach it as though you have and know what's in it. So we're going to look at this book in this way. And let me remind you that chapter 3 of the book is actually the pivot of the book, the center of the book. Chapter 3 is sort of it's not the climax of the book, certainly, but it's that moment in which the main event appears in the text. In fact, that's what the book is really all about, as we'll point out in a moment. The plot by Haman to destroy the Jews, which is revealed in chapter 3, is sort of the pivot point upon which the book is built. So chapters 1 and 2 then give us in detail how it is that Esther, a Jewess, is able to rise to the throne of Persia in anticipation of this event that takes place in chapter 3, the pivot event. So the anticipation is here in these first 2 chapters of the threat that would come against her people from Haman. So what we want to look at this morning then is chapters 1 and 2. Now, I'm going to do this in 3 parts this morning. I'm going to look first at the king's banquet, and then we'll look at the queen's refusal to come to the banquet, and then we'll look at the crowning of Esther in chapter 2. You will notice the book starts out, again, as I pointed out last week, with a time frame. Verses 1 to 3 is a time frame. When did these events take place in the history of the world? And I don't want to go back over the territory I went over last week, but I want to remind you that this section, verses 1 to 3, is designed to explain why a banquet was being held in the city of Susa. Why was there a banquet? Why did this king throw a great feast? By the way, the word feast appears a number of times in this book. So when you look at this first part, even though it talks about who this king is and where he's ruling from and what he ruled over, the idea of all of that is to simply say, this king threw a great feast. All right? And it goes on to explain as to why. The section is also designed to demonstrate who this king is. Who is this Ahasuerus? I will, as I said last week, refer to him as Xerxes the First once in a while, because that's his Persian title. This is a man who is an emperor. All right, let's be reminded of this fact. He's ruling over an empire, a vast swath of territory. In fact, you could make the argument that this king is ruling over the entire known world at the time. When I say known, I mean that part of the Middle East in which the sort of the cradle of civilization grew up and became the center of human civilization. Now, I realize there's a vast civilization to the east in India and China that's also well underway at this time. But when we think of the known world, this is sort of what we consider. Basically everything from Europe to the Indus River in the middle of what's today modern Pakistan. He's ruling over a vast swath of territory, but he's also controlling a vast bureaucracy. He's ruling over a vast empire of peoples, but he's also controlling a vast bureaucracy. There are provincial governors that are a part of his cabinet. There are military leaders and various other kinds of officials who are all involved in his situation. In fact, you will notice there's a mention of Persia and Media in the midst of verse 3, at least in the ESV. Persia and Media in that verse are actually provinces in the larger territory known as Persia. And it's called Persia because the province of Persia is housing the citadel of Susa. So the entire empire takes its name from the province that's where the capital is located. Okay? So these are providences in the midst of this territory. This is an emperor ruling over a vast swath of territory and controlling a vast bureaucracy, but it is also an emperor possessing a tremendous amount of wealth. And that wealth is not only in terms of gold and silver, but it's also in terms of vast lands and, probably the most important resource, human beings. A massive number of people are under his control, and he can use them to his advantage. And so there's this massive amount of capital that this emperor is controlling, both elemental capital and human capital. Now, the book then opens with a realistic introduction to a king with tremendous power. This king exerts a tremendous amount of power. We must not forget this point. In fact, I would argue this is probably the key point that you need to keep in mind as you read these first two chapters. This is a man with unlimited power to do as he wills with whomever he wills and whenever he wills to do it. He controls people, he controls territory, he controls money, he controls much. He's an emperor. We're not familiar with the concept of emperors here in the 21st century, but in the 5th century BC, this was a man who was an emperor, ruling over a vast swath of territory, a bureaucracy, and capital. And the entirety of this book revolves around that display of power. You will notice, for example, that there are a number of edicts which are included in this book, in which this king will stand and make an edict which will have to go out across the land. It'll be very important to remember that because these edicts are key to understanding how this book will unfold. Now, here's what I want you to consider. From a redemptive historical perspective, the real power at play here is the power of the invisible God clearly at work throughout the events. The tremendous irony here is here you have a man who is controlling a vast swath of territory, immense human capital and material wealth, and a massive bureaucracy covering thousands of miles of space, and yet he is nothing more than a puppet in the hands of a creator God who is in fact invisible in this text. He's not mentioned, but he's clearly there. So from a redemptive historical perspective, in other words, from where this book sits in the Bible as a picture of events in time and space, as narratives are, this is not just a picture of a man who with great power. This is a picture of God with unlimited power behind him. He might have power, virtually unlimited power compared to us, but his power is insignificant compared to the God behind it. That's the thought that needs to occupy your mind when you consider the power of this man. As we think about this man exercising his power, doing what he has been given the authority to do as an emperor ruling over a vast swath of territory, this man has this power, but only as a secondary power under the primary one being exercised above him. So while God may never be mentioned in the book, he is in fact the true emperor behind the book. Xerxes may have human kingly power, but his power is insignificant compared to what God could and would do along the way. Probably one of the greatest laugh lines in this book is the fact that here is a king with massive power to do what he wills, and yet he cannot control his own wife. So now this king, according to verse 3, or the second half of verse 3 and into verse 4, the story begins with this king showing the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. In fact, for 180 days, about 6 months of time. Now, what's going on here? Here's a king who holds an open house. That's what he does. He holds an open house. Massive 6-month-long open house. And here's what he's doing. I think there's two purposes that are intertwined in what he does in showing off his glory and his splendor for 180 days. The first is to begin the preparations for an invasion of Greece. Now, you get to know this from the book, but you can know this from other sources, from secular history. This very same king, by the name of Xerxes I, attempts to push the empire farther to the west. The empire at this particular point is all the way through Asia Minor, up to the very doorstep of Greece itself. And this king wants to push that empire even further to the west into Greece. So he will launch an attack against the Greeks in 480 BC. Remember, this book takes place right around, very close to this, a little earlier than this. 3 years, in fact, hence, from this point. He will launch an attack against the Greeks at a battle known as Thermopylae. I did pronounce that right. Thermopylae. I didn't think I would. I practiced all week. And he was eventually able to conquer most of Greece. This is a very famous battle, by the way, in the history of the Greeks. It's one of the first major losses of the Greeks in their world. And it sort of, in many ways, was considered by secular historians to be the battle which gave fire to the rise of the Greeks and Alexander and his father. It gave impetus to them to fight back against the Persians. I think that one of the things that's going on here in this 180-day show-off or open house is that this king displays his royal glory and splendor. And it may very simply be his way of gathering his military leaders and his allies and creating in them a sense of awe, a sense of dedication, and a sense of confidence. In other words, for 6 months, it could be that this king gathered around him all of his military leaders, gathered around him leaders from other nations that he saw as allies. For example, all the provincial governors of the area, many of which were foreigners. And then others, like his officials, and gathered them together and showed them all that he possessed and said, listen, you guys can trust me. When we decide to take on the Greeks, I've got everything we're going to need. Let me show you the capital, the power, the wealth that I possess. Let me show you all of my splendor and glory. Meaning I'm going to show you everything that I have so that you have a sense of awe And not only a sense of awe, but a sense of, yeah, we can trust this king. We can follow him. He's got the capital. We can accomplish it. Those Greeks, they're going down, in other words. So it's 6 months of showing off in order for himself as an emperor to be able to glean the kind of loyalty and the kind of commitment that he would need from these men in the future. Remember, this Battle of Thermopylae is only 3 years hence. So he's preparing for this. This 6-month display of his royal glory and splendor may simply be this way of gathering his military leaders. But there's a second purpose, which might be it, and I think this is probably more likely the case as well, and that is that this is a man who simply wants to show off. He wants to show off his vanity and his pride in all of what he possesses. This, by the way, is a problem amongst emperors of the time. Hey, look, if you've got great wealth, what are you going to do with it? You might as well show it off, right? Because it's no use if you don't. I mean, what's the point of having it all if you don't really show it off, right? This was a problem even amongst the kings of Israel. Solomon opened his great palace, showed it off. The Queen of Sheba came, took a look. You remember Hezekiah's great downfall was the fact that he opened up his capital and showed off what he had. It cost him eventually his own throne in doing so. You see, in human terms, greatness is only great if you show it off. In human terms, greatness is only great if you show it off. But in biblical terms, greatness is only great if it's humble and submissive under God. Notice the contrast. In human terms, when there is no God, what do? You have to show off what you have because it's all you have. You can't take it with you. You never see a hearse you never see a U-Haul trailer behind a hearse, right? Almost blew that joke. You can't take it with you. So what do you got to do with it? You got to do what you can with it in this life because that's all you've got. But in biblical terms, for those of us who know this Christ, as much greatness as we might have or think we possess, ultimately our greatness is found best in humility before God. Our greatness is not our greatness at all, but the greatness of the one who is great with a capital G. So here's a king who wants to show off his great wealth and he wants to prepare for what's going to come. By the way, if you're doing the math here, you'll notice that the Battle of Thermopylae happens before Queen Esther comes to the throne. Now, in verses 5 to 9, then, we're given the details of this great banquet. We're told that this is a banquet held in the citadel in Susa. It's a palatial party fit for a king, according to verse 9. There's another one that's given by Queen Vashti. So this is a party specifically for the men. So this is a gentleman's party only. Secondly, it's a banquet that's open to everyone in the city, both great and small. Or the better way to say that is every official at every level. Okay, so this is not a public party in the sense of every single person that might have been living near the capital, but rather this is for all the officials, for everybody who mattered, if you will, in the life of the king, no matter how great or how small your title was. Thirdly, we're told that the banquet was a lavish affair. Based on the description that you get in verse 6 and verse 7, you get this idea that the palace was decorated to the nines. Is that a phrase used in the South? Well, it's decorated, let's put it that way, all right? It's even got, I thought it's interesting, we probably wouldn't think of this as all that important living here in the South, but there were white cotton curtains apparently. In that day, that would have been a big deal. The banquet was accompanied by a woman's banquet, as I mentioned before, so there was hosted by the queen, but it was also in the palace. If you read the verse carefully, you'll notice that another location in this palace, where whatever size it was, the women also had their own party. And it says that the banquet was a full 7-day affair. Now notice the 7 days is after the 180 days of showing off. Once the king has felt that his glory and his splendor has been properly shown to everybody out there, so they've all seen how great he is, now he throws a feast now and says, okay, I'm ready to end this thing, so let's have a great feast, drinking and so forth. Notice verses 8 and 10 both speak of the fact that there was plenty of wine a-flowing in this particular event. Now, what is the intention of this banquet then? Why does this king throw it? As I said above, the king is demonstrating his great wealth. He's building loyalty amongst those he would rely on for his continuing conquests as an emperor, and so it seems reasonable that he would throw a party for all of them in order to solidify that. You know, if you got invited to the party, you're going to feel like an insider. You're going to feel like, I'm going to give my loyalty to this king. And that's precisely what these kind of banquets were often for. They were an opportunity for men to come to the party and sit with the king and drink with him and raise a glass to him and toast him and say, I'm in, I'm committed to this. And so he would have their loyalty expressed outwardly. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. But of course, the second reason, and the much more important one, I think, is that this is a natural expression of this man's depravity. This is a natural expression of this man's human depravity. It's a week-long indulgence of the senses, simply because he could. All right, make no mistake about it, this ain't a dinner party. Okay? This is a week-long festival of drunkenness and sexuality and gluttony. All right? It's watered down in our text, right? You don't really see it as you read it. But if you understood the times and you understood what this man is doing and what kind of a man that he was, you understand that this book, that this party, I should say, is an expression of the human depravity of this man. Who he really is comes out at such a party. And we'll see why in a moment here. Now here I want you to stop at this point and consider the irony here. There's irony after irony in this book, okay? I said last week, this is a book that has all of the best features of some of the best fiction that you could write, even though it's nonfiction. And one of those elements is irony. Good story turns on twists along the way. The book starts off with a man throwing a great feast. And the whole book is a description of why the Jews have a regular feast on their calendar. You see it? Here's a king who throws a drunken party, indulging the senses in every way imaginable in order to demonstrate his great wealth, but also to dabble in all of his various human depravities. And that's contrasted, when you get to the end of the book, with a people who set up and celebrate year upon year a feast in which they are grateful and thankful for survival. See the irony there? Gluttony on the one hand, survival on the other. So it's designed for us as you start the book out, as you think about this great banquet, think about this great feast, you think about it as it is contrasting the rest of the book. So you get a picture of an emperor, what kind of a man that he is, what he's about to undertake, what he wants from those around him, and what he'll do to get it in terms of indulging his depravity to get there. It's a feast of personal indulgence which begins the process of another feast coming into being. Now, once the feast is on its way then, we are told in verse 10, on the seventh day, in other words, the seventh day of this particular feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, which is a euphemism for, explain it to your kids later, he commanded the 7 eunuchs, whose names are listed here, who serve in the presence, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Now, again, let's remind you what we have here. It says that his heart was merry with wine. We know what that means, right? It means his inhibitions were lowered. All right, let's just leave it there. And he also tells us that his wife was lovely to look at, which means that this request was not simply, come and show me your beauty, This is a lewd request. He wants a lewd performance before these men. As I said at the beginning, this is a banquet which is designed to indulge all of the various appetites, quote unquote, that these men would have. Remember, it's a men's party, right? The women are having their own party in another place. So this is a men's party, and the king finally decides that even his wife is to come and to perform before the men, which explains why it is in verse 12 that the queen refuses to come. Otherwise, what other reason would you have? I mean, what other reason would you have if, in fact, this was not something nefarious for her? And so her refusal is based on that reality. By the way, the 7 eunuchs that are mentioned here by name are the men who have been, again, I'll euphemize this for the children, physically altered so that they can serve this queen in such a way that they are not tempted by their service before the queen, all right? That's important to understand. They have no appetites of such, and thus they are able to serve the queen intimately. Now, you will notice that the text itself does not give us the reasons why the queen refuses. We have to imply it. It doesn't take much for us to figure it out, of course, but there's no reason specifically given. I think the reasons are obvious. But this woman specifically rejects the command of her husband and her emperor. Now, let's not forget this. As I said, I set this up earlier because I want you to consider what this woman is doing. This woman is looking into the face of the man who holds more power on this earth than any other human being. He is the emperor. He is the one controlling a vast swath of territory. He has a vast bureaucracy under his fingers. He owns tremendous wealth and power and is unafraid to use it. One of the other things that you're not told in the book of Esther, you can get from secular sources, is that this man has a temper problem. We learned this, by the way, from his attacks upon the Greeks and how he responds to certain setbacks along the way. He has a serious temper problem. And so this woman rejecting this king is not just saying, well, no, thank you, I don't want to come. This woman is making a choice to take her life into her own hands. She is putting herself in a position where she knows the consequences of her choice. She knows. She knows exactly what could happen to her in this case. There have been lesser men in the history of the world who have done graver things to their wives when they refused. And so she knows precisely what she's doing when she says no, when she refuses. Notice the end of the sentence in verse 12. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. That's a hint for us of what's really going on here. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and consider this. From our perspective, as we read the story, from our perspective, here's a woman who is making a free choice. All right, I say free in the sense that she's making this choice of her own volition. She is choosing not to obey her husband in this particular case. She's not going to walk in and perform for him and his friends in this party they're having. She's not going to do this. But her choice precipitates the rise of Queen Esther. Her choice not to obey her husband becomes the basis by which another queen, of course, rises. In other words, I would put it this way, as I think of this story, again, the invisible hand of a mighty power is at work behind this text. God ordains for her to refuse, even though it was her choice to refuse. It was certainly her choice not to accept the invitation of this king. It was her choice to put herself in harm's way. In fact, fatally harm's way. She has chosen not to do so. She has acted according to her own freedom to do so. In her own heart of hearts, she decided, I will not do this, even though the consequences may be deadly. But the fact is that it was ordained by God for her to choose this way. This is an example, a strong example in the Old Testament of the compatibility between the human will of men and the ordained will of God. God's will being accomplished through the choices of human beings. Now, in this case, it's a good choice. All of us, I think, would agree that the woman did the right thing. She chose not to act in this way. There's no indication here that she knows the God of Israel. There's no indication here that she has any revelation whatsoever of the God of Israel, and yet the God of Israel ordains over her a choice that will ultimately rise to the condition of another queen coming to take her place. It's an example of the compatibility between our choosing, our will, and our ability to go into the world and to do what we do, and yet God, through it all, ordaining and accomplishing His ends through it. It's a concept, by the way, that's really beyond our comprehension. It's difficult for us to grasp the idea that all of our decisions are ours to make. We are not puppets in the hand of God. And anyone who argues that Reformed theology believes that we're nothing more than puppets in the hands of God has built a straw man. That is not what we believe. We fully believe that men are capable, women are capable of making choices. God has given to us will. All of our confessions argue with the strongest of language that God does not crush the will of the creature, ever. He does not supersede the will of the creature. He does not demand us to act. He does not force us to act in any way. Yet, in all of our freedom to act, He ordains and accomplishes His perfect will. Our choices will always align with His purposes, even our sinful choices. He does not cause us to sin, nor does He cause us to act rightly, as this queen did, but He does use all of it to accomplish His will. The book of Esther, if nothing else, should teach you this point. God's not pictured. He's not named anywhere in the book. And yet it's obvious, isn't it, that He acts to accomplish Esther becoming the queen and saving the people of Israel. Thus, it flows all the way back to a decision by one woman who refuses to come. God's ordination over a choice fully compatible with His will. Now, the king obviously responds to this. So verses 13 to 22 are his response. His response, his choice, okay? She had one, she made one. Now, here's his choice to response. What I find funny again in this book, again, notice the comedy in this book. Here's a man who apparently is ruling a vast empire, and yet, even in the face of his wife's decision, he can't make a decision himself. Notice how it reads. He calls together his wise men who knew the times. And there's a parenthesis in the ESV, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. Okay, and he goes on from there. But basically, he calls together the wise men and said, well, what should I do? Now, I could make a pretty good argument here. I won't press this point too terribly, but I could make a pretty good argument here that that's true about most of us who are husbands. We simply don't know what to do in the face of our wives. I won't press that point, though, because I don't think I could make it biblically. He does not issue a decree on his own. He consults his wise men, and there's one of the wise men by the name of Memucan, who's one of the 7 princes. If you go back to verse 3, he's one of the 7 princes that are part of this great royal show-off or open house that the king does over time. And he delivers the verdict. He delivers a suggestion to the king. And he comes to the king and he says, look, the issue is not the fact that Vashti's refused to come to the party. Yeah, that's a problem, but that's not really the problem. And this is clever, by the way, on the part of Memucan. The problem is, he says, what would happen in the empire if the wives of officials everywhere used this queen's response as an example and started harboring contempt for their husbands at home? Gasp! Imagine what would happen if women all over this empire started turning to their husband and say, well, Queen Vashti didn't come to the king, so I don't have to come to you. In other words, this Memucan says, hey, king, you got a bigger problem than just one woman. Every woman in the empire is now going to be tempted to follow this along. I think it's highly likely that Memucan already has this problem in his own home. So he decides this would be the best way to solve the problem, right? We'll figure out a way in order to make sure that every woman's honoring a husband. So he brings forth this suggestion to issue an edict. And by the way, this is the first of 4 main edicts in this book that will be issued by the king. Issue an edict declaring that all women must give honor to their husbands. Issue an edict in which every woman in the empire, including, by the way, Vashti, she's part of the edict, is to give honor to her husband. I love this. I find this tremendously hilarious. Attempting to legislate the honor of wives for their husbands. How in the world are you going to enforce that? Seriously, how are you going to enforce this? It's an edict. You will give honor to your husband. How in the world are you going to enforce this? You're going to have the police standing outside every woman's house throughout the entirety of the empire, watching to see when the woman doesn't give honor and exactly what is it mean to give honor and so forth. Again, it's preposterous, isn't it? I mean, think about it. It really is a preposterous edict. It makes no sense. It's one of those ideas in the mind of a man who thinks he has power and thinks he has might and he can command whatever he wants to and issue edicts that cannot be rescinded, and yet the thing is worthless. It's not even worth the paper it's written on because it's impossible to enforce. It's funny, but that's the point of it. That's the writer's intention. He wants you to see the humor in this. He wants you to see how ridiculous this is. He wants you to understand that when you try to legislate morality or whatever, guess what happens? You can't. You can't make women honor their husbands, much as you can't make husbands honor their wives, right? The only way that can happen is when hearts are changed, right? The only way that you can create honor amongst people, the only way that you can get a husband to honor his wife and a wife to honor a husband, according to someone we read just recently, I don't remember where, but somewhere, is when you have Christ in the center of it. That's the only real way. So the point of the story is designed to get you to realize just how preposterous this really is. It's an edict. Yes, it's sent to the 4 corners of the empire. And everybody goes, ooh, it's an edict from the king. And if I was the typical wife in my typical home in the empire somewhere, say I was a Jew somewhere, I would ask myself, I wonder how this is supposed to go. What am I supposed to do differently than what I'm doing now? And how am I going to get thrown in jail if I don't? Again, God ordained for this to take place. Now, if you look at verse 19, it says that the king, verse 19, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him and let it be written among the laws of the Persians, the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. I think when I read this text that she's being banished. Divorced and banished, sent away from the king. Although, amongst Jewish tradition, this queen is executed. If you read the story of Purim that's published online, this story reads that she's killed. They interpret it as she's killed. But the way I read it is that she's banished. Either way, she's not a part of the story anymore, whichever way it was. And again, as we come to the end of chapter 1, it is God who ordains this, isn't it? It is God who ordained the choice of the woman not to come to her husband, and it's the choice of the man to banish his wife so that she's no longer queen. Now there's an emptiness there. All of it is under the ordination of God. The entirety of the chapter is a picture of the preposterousness of human beings. Their depravity, they're indulging themselves, issuing edicts that cannot be enforced. And the list goes on and on of all kinds of stupid things that are going on. And yet here's God standing back behind it all, smiling and going, yeah, watch this. Watch what I'm going to do now. You see it? You see the picture here? We look around and we think, oh yes, I've got control over everything and everything is going to work out just the way that I want it to and life is going to go exactly as I want to. Ha, 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 ha. God laughs. Which leads us to chapter 2 then. Before we can come to Queen Esther, however, we're introduced to a man by the name of Mordecai. I'll have you fast forward to verse 5. There was a Jew in Susa whose biography is then listed, starting there and going down to verse 8. There's a few things that we learn about this man, and by extension, Esther as well. We learn that Mordecai and Esther are Benjamites. They are from the tribe that's intimately connected with the southern kingdom of Judah. You remember that when the tribes broke up after Solomon, 10 tribes broke away under Jeroboam I. 2 remained. Those 2 tribes were Judah and Benjamin. This particular southern kingdom, you remember, was exiled under Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Jeconiah is mentioned here in verse 6. He is the second to last king of the southern kingdom. There's one more after him, but he's the one whom Nebuchadnezzar carted off in exile. So according to verse 6, now this is a group of people that are under Persian control. In verse 5, we are told that Mordecai is descended from Kish. It's possible that this is a Kish who is the father of Saul, the first king of Israel. So in other words, the way it would read is that this man Mordecai was the direct son of Jair, a son of Shimei, which is a son of Kish, going all the way back to the days of Saul. Now, part of the reason that scholars believe that when they read this is because it would explain the hostility of Haman. Okay, it would explain the hostility of Haman. You say, well, how is that? Here's why. Haman, we are told in chapter 3, is an Agagite, meaning he's a descendant of Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites that Saul spared when he had an opportunity to destroy the Amalekites. Remember, he was told by God, wipe out the Amalekites, get rid of them from the face of the earth. But Saul decided, no, I'm going to keep a few, and I'm going to keep the king. And he made the excuse, well, I didn't think it was necessary to destroy all this stuff, even though God had told him to do so. Remember, that's the reason why Saul lost his throne. It's very possible that it is from that particular choice on the part of Saul to save King Agag, that a people sprang from him from which this Haman is descended, which means that his hatred of the Jews goes all the way back to the time of Saul. I would argue that all of the hatred of the Middle East goes back to these days, and it's still continuing in our day. But that may explain why it was that there's this ancient blood feud that exists between these two people. We also learned that Mordecai is Esther's first cousin, she being the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. Her Jewish name is Hadassah. So this book really could be called the Book of Hadassah. her Jewish name. But her Persian name is Esther, and that's the name by which she's referred to throughout the book, because you will notice her connection to the Persian king is what matters here, and so the Persian name is what's being used. I would argue that's the exact same point, or the exact same reason that Paul uses his Roman name of Paul when he writes, because he's writing to a Gentile audience. Remember, he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and so he starts using his Roman name, and I think that's exactly the same reason that Esther is using her Persian name here. It's context, right? You will notice also that Mordecai raises this girl as his own daughter after she is orphaned, according to verse 7. Which implies to me, I don't know, maybe not to you, but to me that she's quite a bit younger than him. Could imply that she may have been just a child at the point where he, as her first cousin, takes her into his home. Mordecai is instrumental in getting Esther into the king's new, and I'm going to call this a queen harem. All right, I'll explain what that means in a moment. She is, according to this text, outwardly beautiful, which is the means by which she qualifies for this harem. And I don't want you to, again, miss the irony here. One beautiful woman replaced by another beautiful woman. Okay? I don't want you to miss that point. It's part of the very text. Okay, now, how does this woman rise to become queen? We'll go through this fairly quickly because the details are not as important as you might think. They're just details. The king's young men, all right, these are men who surround the king. They're the yes men the king has around him, always telling him what he wants to hear. And he's gotten lonely now that he doesn't have a queen. And so they suggest to him, according to verses 1 to 4, to build what I call a queen harem. Now this would be separate from the other harems that he might have, okay? This is a queen harem. It's specifically designed to choose a new one. Okay, now I want to just stop here for a moment and remind you, please be careful here. Do not import New Testament ideas of sexual morality into the story. I know you get like, what? Esther would get involved in a harem and she would be part of a queen? This is preposterous. This is just wrong. You're importing New Testament sexual morality here, okay? This is 500 years before Christ. This is back in a time when these sorts of things were semi-normal in the world. And so we might think that they're preposterous and utterly wrong, and they are in the sense that the picture of marriage painted in Genesis 1 is the picture of one man and one woman. But we haven't gotten there yet through the progressive revelation of Scripture. And we won't really get to the fullness of this idea of one man and one woman until you get to the New Testament. We're still 500 years prior to this, okay? So be careful here. I know that our natural reaction is to be disgusted by it, and rightly so, but let's not burden ourselves with Esther's immorality here when she may not have known any better. The queen harem, then, is led by a man by the name of Haggai, the eunuch. He's another one of these physically altered men, all right? And he finds Esther worthy. Okay, notice verses 8 to 11. She rises up amongst all these women collected throughout the empire that are brought into this harem to become the eventual, through which the eventual queen will be found. He finds her to be more worthy than all the rest. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things about Mordecai here. Mordecai instructs Esther to keep her ethnicity a secret. Don't tell the king or anyone else that you're a Jew. Why? Probably because he believed that her status as a foreigner or an exile would taint her before the king. Now again, have you noticed? What's Mordecai's objective here? Have you ever asked that question? What's Mordecai's objective here? Mordecai keeps a vested interest in what's happening to Esther as a part of this harem. Look at verse 11. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. He has a vested interest in her being a part of this group. He puts her there. Now, I think at this point Mordecai has no reason to suspect any danger for the Jews, does he? Does Mordecai at this point believe that the Jews are in mortal danger? No, because the plot of Haman doesn't show up until chapter 3. So he's not sending Esther to the harem in order to protect the Jews. He's sending this woman to this harem because it gives him something. He's going to gain from this. It's a self-advancing motive here at this point in the story. She, as queen, would imply a special place for him in the eyes of the emperor. Come on. Let's not think of Mordecai as some sort of saint here, folks. He's got a self-advancing motive. What does he want to do? He wants to get his beautiful cousin into this harem to maybe become the next queen of Persia so that he might become someone special in this great kingdom, you think? Remember, the plot is not revealed. He doesn't even discover a plot about the king's being, a plot against the king until you get to the end of chapter 2. So he's not aware of any of those sorts of things. There's no reason for Mordecai to believe. Now, we know, of course, that God behind the scenes is using this choice of Mordecai to push this woman forward, and that fact that she's beautiful and that she has a wonderful personality and that she apparently looks good in a swimsuit, you know, all the stuff that Miss America is doing away with, that's all now important. He knows it, and he's put her forward for this particular reason. You'll notice the queen harem requires a beautification period of each woman of 12 months. They stayed in this harem before they even went to the king for 12 months. And then each member of this harem would be given a single night to impress the king. Again, read between the lines here. What's going on? This is a woman who would, when her number came up, she would go and spend the night with this king in an attempt to impress him enough that he would embrace her as his next queen. You know what that means, don't you? When Esther went to the king, we're told in verses 15 to 18, her natural charm and beauty easily won him over. She has a natural charm, she has a natural beauty, she has a personality, and such that he just falls for her. Now, of course, we know that this is a setup, right? We know it's a setup, and the setup is that God has purposed her to have all of these things, and somehow he works in the king's heart that he might find her to be the one. It doesn't say how many women are in this harem, but if it takes a full year for them to get through the beautification ritual, how many women do you think have to be in it in order for one to go every night? I would say a lot. This happens to be the one that wins her over. And you'll notice in verse 18 that the king throws another feast. Another feast. This one, queen's feast, her feast, celebrating the fact that he's found his new queen in this Esther. By the way, that's the second of 5 feasts that you'll find in this book. So it's an important theme. Now, all of that, here's what it does. Chapters 1 and 2 then, as I said earlier, set the stage for the events to follow. Right? Remember we talked about this last week, the idea of Esther being in the right place at the right time. And I would even extend that sentence to say, and having all the right attributes. Right? All of that coincidence. It's not coincidence, of course. Mordecai is working to get his cousin into the harem. There's choices being made by individuals. God is ordaining all of it up above. It's a series of seemingly disconnected events. A banquet, a lewd call, a refusal, a queen deposed, a beautiful foreigner living in the city, a shrewd Jew, a wise eunuch, and the list goes on, of all these things that seem to come together to get her to be in the right place in the right time. All these things coming together to place this one specific woman in one specific place of power in anticipation of the events to follow. No human being could have orchestrated these events, but God did. In fact, that's what I call it. I call it a beautiful choreography. A beautiful choreography of the providence of God over every detail in the story. We step back, we read the story, we find motives here, we find motives there, we find people making choices here and there, and all these sorts of things. And we step back from this text and we look down upon it from a high view, and what do we see? We see a choreography. We see God orchestrating events to accomplish His ends and purposes. Don't forget, these 2 chapters of the book encompass the first 7 years of the story. And then a few more years unfold even before you get into chapter 3. So the bulk of the story, quote unquote, in terms of time, is encapsulated in these 2 chapters. But it's accordioned together into one quick story by the author in order to make a humorous point. All of these things, as much as they might look like they're under human control by people who think they have power or people who don't, it's all being choreographed by God to a specific point. And to me, here's the application I would make. It's simple. Every single thing that is in your life right now has been orchestrated by God in His sovereignty to prepare you for what is coming. Everything. Everything that God has purposed, everything that's happening in life, no matter what's happened, no matter how good or bad it is, no matter what it is, no matter what decisions you've made, good or bad, either way, all of the things that have happened to lead you to this point, right here, right now, at this moment, has all been choreographed by God. Every bit of it. You've made a lot of decisions, you've made a lot of choices, some of them good, some of them bad. You've made right choices, you've made wrong choices. Your circumstances sometimes have been good, your circumstances have sometimes been bad. Sometimes evil things have happened to you, sometimes good things have happened to you. All along the way, everything that's happened to you, all along the way up to this point, has been God choreographing your life in anticipation of what's coming tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, when we get to the end of the day tomorrow, I can say the same thing. Everything in your life that's happened up to this point is preparing you for what's happening tomorrow. And so it goes. The sovereignty of God is not this theoretical idea that God's in control of the whole world. The sovereignty of God is God acting in and through the details of every one of our lives, orchestrating all of the events that take place during the course of your existence in preparation for what He has next. And then what He has after that. And then what He has after that. This is what makes the sovereign nature of our God so very comforting. I don't know what tomorrow brings, and neither do you. None of us have any idea what's planned for us tomorrow. For all I know, tomorrow at this time it could be dead. But here's what I know. God has orchestrated everything to this point. And so when I look at my life and I see all of the difficulties and the trials and the tribulations and the struggles and the pains and the agonies and the defeats, I look at all that and say, well, those are preparing me for what's coming tomorrow. And the next day, and the next day. And we can trust this God because He has the ability to control so much and accomplish so well what it is He wants to accomplish. We don't emphasize the sovereignty of God simply because it differentiates us from the rest of the Baptist world. We emphasize the sovereignty of God because it is the basis upon which we have the ability to get out of bed in the morning and face the day, knowing that everything that happened to you yesterday and the day before and the day before that, all the way back to the day you were born, and I would argue to 10,000 years before that, was so that you're ready and He's ready for what's coming tomorrow. That is comforting. God knows what's coming, and He's prepared you for it. So let us not go around grumbling about all the rotten things that have happened to us. When I hear people grumbling about the rotten things, I'm thinking, you don't really understand what God's doing, do you? God is using all that to prepare you for what's coming tomorrow. Now, God may have something really rotten in store for you tomorrow, But the rottenness of yesterday is preparing you for the rottenness of tomorrow. The good of yesterday is preparing you for the good of tomorrow. Either way, all things work together for the good of him who loves Christ. Esther is on the throne now because God has purposed it all through all these weird events that take place, all these ironical, humorous edicts that are being published. But here's the deal. In the end, God got her on that throne exactly where he wanted her in anticipation of what's about to come. And so next week, Lord willing, we'll see what is about to come.